introduce you. Slides. Yes. Okay. All right. Super. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. This is our fourth session of this fall's Education Policy Colloquium Series, sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance, or PEPG. My name is Jim Pizer. I'm an academic visitor here at the Kennedy School, and it's my honor and privilege to host this speaker series alongside Professors Paul Peterson and Marty West here at Harvard, which meets most Thursday afternoons, and Thursday at noon in particular here in Taubman. Of course, next week is an exception, which we're taking a week off. And so our next session will be on October 30th, featuring Joel Shevsky and Thiru Vignaraja, whose presentation is entitled "Breaking the Promise of Brown, the Seattle Supreme Court Case and Its Implications on School Diversity." And if I remember that case correctly, I think it goes back to something like 2007, and it was related to a voluntary desegregation program that Seattle had established. So anyway, I hope you'll be able to join that session in 2 weeks, not 1 week, 2 weeks. Today's session features our very own Dr. Paul Peterson. Paul is known for many things. Among them is writing and publishing provocative research. In fact, I think that's all you do, Paul. It's all provocative. And today is no exception, with the presentation of a new study on the impact of staffing increases on student achievement, posing the culinary question, do too many cooks spoil the broth? Paul is the Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government here at Harvard, and he's the director of PEPG, the sponsor of this colloquium series. He's also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and he's the senior editor of Education Next, a journal of opinion and research, among many other things. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Education, among many other prestigious affiliations and awards. After Paul's comments, we'll have time for discussion, question and answer. Hopefully we'll have some people who are watching us online here over the Zoom. If there are any questions or comments that they have, we'll try to integrate them into the discussion as well. Obviously, as that implies, this is being recorded, so everything is on the record. And with that, it's my privilege to turn the program over to our fearless leader, Dr. Paul Peterson.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Jim, for that nice intro. I took the privilege of putting myself on the agenda, which I don't do too often, but which I thought would give me a chance to try out some new ideas. You're the first to hear these. And I've been working on this project with Carlos Lastra, who's in Spain, so he can't join us today, though I think he's going to peek in at some point. I think he's got a conflicting obligation, but he may be able to join us before the end. And so we may be able to hear what he thinks as well. We're going to ask this question: do increases in personnel density lift student achievement? Well, to put that in simple language. If you add people to a school district, will you get a benefit in terms of student achievement as measured on the National Assessment of Education Progress? So that's the question. And I have to apologize that we're not going to give you some technical material because the U.S. Department of Education restricts the release of privileged data until they've approved it to make sure that we haven't violated the privacy of students. So it's a complicated process, takes quite a while, and it's taking longer these days than ever before. And so we have to present these results in non-technical terms. So I think the basic points are perfectly clear, but those of you who would like to see some specific numbers will just have to take it on faith. There we go. My apologies. So the answers to these questions in summary, to give you fair warning, you can walk out after you see this slide, is that increases in the size and density of a school district do not benefit students. if the district is already large, or if it's already dense, or if you're a disadvantaged student, or if your district has a declining enrollment. Although it does benefit small districts, and it does benefit Hispanic students, surprisingly, is a contrast with other disadvantaged students. And sometimes it benefits white students. So that's the basic findings. And of course, this would not be an interesting paper if it didn't violate conventional wisdom. And so the conventional wisdom is that the only class size I consider to be small is 0, right? So we always want smaller classes. I like small classes. I told Harvard that the class I just taught before this session could only have no more than 24 students. Yes, I don't like big classes, right? I like small classes. And this was pretty generous as it is. Some professors say 10, right? So parents like small classes, students like small classes, teachers like small classes, even Jim Pizer likes small classes. And classes have become smaller. The pupil-staff ratio has declined, and the pupil-teacher ratio has declined. Both teachers and non-teachers, there's more of them given the number of students as the years have gone by. So most of the decline was in the period between 1950 and 1980, and some decline since then, as dramatic as it was. We have been moving in that direction. What's happened since 2003 is that the number of students has remained about the same. That's the green line across there. So that the number of students in the United States has remained about the same. The number of teachers has remained about the same. Really, we haven't added a lot of new teachers over and above what's needed to keep pace with the number of students. But the number of paraprofessionals has increased a lot, and the number of school staff members who don't teach but are in the schools. They're in the schools, but they don't teach. That's increased quite dramatically since 2003. Now, there are theories out there about size and density. And the classic economic theory is that there's a positive return to scale. The larger the system, the more people within an organization, the more efficient it is because you can have a division of labor. And then there's the science of public administration theory. The classical literature on that said we should have bigger school districts, we should have bigger municipalities, we should have metropolitan areas should be combined together. Bigger is better. So we want to have a consolidation. So the classical theory has always been bigger is better. But the organizational theory that developed pretty much at Carnegie Mellon under March and Simon, especially Simon, but March played a major role as well, began to talk about the fact that organizations can be problematic. Keeping the organization together can be problematic. And Anthony Downs is particularly interesting because he writes so well, and he really puts the hammer on the nail. And then there's the loose coupling theory by Carl White, White or Weak. Maybe somebody here knows whether it's one pronunciation or another. Which is that schools are loosely coupled, and therefore they're a funny organization that's very hard to manage. So these are some of the theories that are out there. And the empirical literature is all over the place. It's scattered, it's inconsistent, it's inconclusive is what I would say. We have the famous class size reduction study by the Tennessee Star people, Kruger reanalyzed, which found that you get payoff from small classes in Tennessee with young children. But the studies that have looked at class size reduction at scale don't find much in the way of benefits. There's a bunch of them out there, and basically they all show more or less the same thing, that you don't get much in the way of benefits. Paraprofessionals, it's not clear that paraprofessionals add a lot to the learning process. Literature is small, but doesn't give much hope. And there's not much literature on people who aren't teachers and their impact on students. We have been expanding the number of non-teachers in the school system without knowing much about whether they're beneficial to the learning process. Now you might say they're beneficial in other ways. That's possible. Students might get breakfast as well as lunch because we have more people working in the kitchens, and that's all good, but does it have any academic payoffs? We don't know too much about that. All right. So let me highlight some of the organizational theory, because that's what I think explains what I'm going to tell you today. The larger any organization becomes, the weaker is the control over its actions exercised by those at the top. So it gets harder and harder to control an organization. As it gets bigger, you add personnel to it. I love these Rube Goldberg cartoons. I hope you all have made an effort to look at some of them. This is the way a school system looks like. You know, right? How we decide. This is probably the superintendent over here. This must be the student. I don't know. Anyhow, this is the capacity of an organization to maintain a complex, highly interdependent pattern of activity is limited in part by its capacity to handle the communication required. That's what March and Simon say in their, classic work on this topic, which everybody should read. Or Down says that as any bureaucratic organization grows larger, the proportion of wasted activity rises. Now we're going to look at this by looking at the National Assessment of Education Progress data. It's got a lot of characteristics that makes it useful for this purpose. We're going to look at the 8th grade math and reading tests. We're going to look at the 10 waves in math and the 10 waves in reading, or a total of 20 waves in these tests. And we're looking, they're every 2 years, except during COVID, it was a 3-year span, but basically it's 2 years. So you have a consistent measurement every 2 years. You have the federal government coming in and administering this test to school districts. And these school districts are a representative sample in each state. So the sample is drawn for each state. And to get a representative sample that's large enough for data analysis, you have to have a lot of tests administered. So there's over 2 million, nearly 2.5 million tests that are administered. These tests have the advantage of being a low stakes test, so there's not likely to be much cheating going on. No individual is identified, no school districts identified, no teachers identified, no principal is identified. It's anonymous. So this is anonymous data. And the data that we have, which includes the individual level data, which is good for the analysis, is anonymized so that we don't know who these people are. Obviously, the public doesn't either. But we do have the demographics on the test taker, so we're able to control for a lot of demographic factors that affect test performance. So we're introducing those as controls. Now we measure personnel density by using data from the National Center for Education Statistics, which has yet to be shut down by the current administration. We're hopeful that they will continue to give us information, the basic kind of information. How many teachers are there in this school district? How many pupils are there in this district? How many paraprofessionals are there? How many non-teachers are there? What's the salary? Now, the salary data is a little sketchy because all we have is the total amount of money spent for instructional purposes and for other non-instructional purposes in each school. So, or each district, sorry, in each district. So this is sort of a problematic indicator. So we're not going to talk about too much about whether there's a benefit from increasing teacher salaries because we don't have very good data on that, but we'll have some information on that and you can take that seriously or not as you see fit. And then we have a bunch of census data that we also use in the analysis. So the basic idea here is the difference in difference. We want to look at a school district which has a certain amount of increase in personnel or decrease in personnel, the change in personnel in a district between a wave, every one of these waves, that's over a 2-year period, as compared to all other districts within the state. So it's a within state analysis. We have state fixed effects in the analysis. So within the state, we're looking at that's the control group, is the statewide average in improvement in student performance or decline in student performance, as the case may be, from one wave to the next. So the important thing is we've eliminated all the variation that exists across between states. We're only looking at the variation within states. And we can do that because we have state representative samples here. So yes, it's true that Mississippi is a lot different from Massachusetts, but we're not comparing Mississippi to Massachusetts. We're comparing some place in Massachusetts with another. Some places you're seeing an increase in personnel, and then the statewide average may be less or more than that. Okay, so this is for those of you who want to see the estimating equation. We can come back to that if you want to look at it in detail. We've excluded the tiny districts. There are 14,000 school districts in the United States. Some of them are very, very small indeed. So the smallest district remaining in our sample has only 84 students enrolled. So even though we've eliminated 10% of all the school districts in the United States, we still have a lot of small school districts. We have a lot of, if you think that 84 is a small school district. Yeah. Okay, skip to the findings. In small districts, adding personnel is beneficial. If you increase the percentage of teachers by 5%, that is for every 100 students, if you increase the number of teachers by 5, for every 100 students, if you increase the number of teachers by 5, you will get an increase in learning of about 1 to 2 months per year, or about twice this amount over the 2 years period. This is a very rough way of translating technical language into lay language, and putting it in this way allows me to present it to you today without violating the terms of the agreement with the Department of Education. And we don't see any adverse effects for professionals or non-teaching staff, but we don't see any beneficial effects. The beneficial effects of the small districts are when you look at increases in teachers. And then we also see an improvement in the performance of both Hispanic students as measured by the NAEP, where they ask districts to classify students' ethnicity into various categories, one of which is Hispanic. And here we see a gain of about 3 months of learning each year. So there's a real payoff here. And this is just speculation on our part that this is probably due to the fact that there's a shortage of bilingual teachers. So a district that's got the capacity to expand the number of personnel, they put it into teachers, they're getting a benefit from this because they've got a teaching staff that's better able to communicate to students who have language issues. And we see the same thing for ELL, by the way. This is not on the slide, but we did a double check to see whether or not English language learners benefited, and we get roughly the same results as we get if we just rely on the Hispanic indicator. Okay, so that's the good news. But in large districts, an increase in density, increase in the number of teachers or other personnel, whether it be paraprofessionals or non-teachers, we get a negative effect. It's not just like we don't get no effect, we get a negative effect. And this is, it's very hard to get, a lot of data shows up with no effect, right? You've seen lots of studies that way. We can't find any effects. So maybe that's just because it's very hard to find an effect in large scale data sets. But to find a negative effect is really quite startling. It's a statistically significant negative effect. So that in these large districts, a 5% increase in personnel translates into about 3 months less learning each year. 3 months less learning each year. You have your hand up.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt. I understand that today you cannot present us with, you cannot show us, parallel trends, but I was wondering could it be the case that these districts are really struggling and they're getting additional funds to hire more teachers exactly because
this is a good question, but let's save it. And let me present the results, and then that's a good question. It deserves a lengthy answer, but it would distract from the clarification, present the data first and then explore that. And this is, we find it for regardless of personnel. So we see it for teachers, but we also see it for paraprofessionals. Pardon my leftover cold. The important thing is 80% of all children in the United States attend schools in large districts. 80% of all students attend schools in large districts. So it's not just like, okay, there's a few big city districts. No, this is like the average size district in our sample has about 1,000 students in it. And so what you get when you get to a large district is any district that's, I think it's over 10,000. So any district that's over 10,000 falls into this category of large district. And we see the same true of density. So if we take a district that already has a high ratio of staff to the number of pupils, it's in the largest quartile of the distribution. We get the same effect. So we get the same effect for the size of the district as for the density. So adding personnel to an already dense district has an adverse effect. Adding personnel to an already large district has an adverse effect. And the two are sort of independent of one another. Density is not highly correlated. It's not that big districts are always dense or small districts are never dense. So the density of a district is not directly correlated with the size of the district very much, to some extent, but not a lot. So both density and size have this negative effect. And the people who suffer the most are Black students and low-income students. Those are eligible for free and reduced lunch. There, the effects are somewhat larger. This is not a big difference between the other students, but it's still statistically significantly larger for Black and for low-income students. And the theory behind this is sort of our thought, is that the senior teachers, when they have a chance to, if they have more chances to migrate, if you're adding personnel, you're giving the senior staff chances to move to where they want to teach, which is where it's easy to teach. And easy to teach usually means not teaching people from disadvantaged backgrounds. So we think that's probably the mechanism for why we're getting additional personnel having negative effects on those who need education the most. And we see a bigger effect in no growth districts. You know, most districts grew during this period in terms of enrollment. You know, the period between 2000 and 2020, as we go forward over the next decade, we're going to see a decline in student enrollment. But over the last 2 decades, we've seen modest increases in enrollment. So most districts have been growing. But some districts have not been growing or actually losing students. Only about 20% of the districts have lost students. But there's another sizable percentage that are not showing any significant growth. And so if we look at the no growth districts, we see that the effects are larger in those districts. But it's not like we don't see this across the board. We also see this across the board, this adverse effect. Now, there's some things we don't find. We're not making a claim here that this is due to collective bargaining, because we checked this out by looking at states that don't have collective bargaining. We had to relax some of our assumptions for this analysis, and you can ask questions about that. But we don't see any effect of collective bargaining. We don't see any effect of partisanship. It's not like these are the Democratic districts that are wasting personnel. We don't see any effects by region. We see this, you know, there's variation among states, but we can't see much of a pattern to the variation. And we see one little bit of a pattern. The three states on the West Coast in the continental United States, state of California, Washington, and Oregon, we see more adverse effects there than elsewhere. So a little bit of a sign of a West Coast phenomenon, but it's not like we would put much weight on that because we don't see any larger consistency in the regional patterns. And we ran a placebo test where we tried to say, okay, what if we find that increasing density of personnel has an adverse effect on the test scores of students 5 years before? You know, the test of students 5 years earlier than when the change in the density takes place. Well, that would be a danger sign if we found the same thing, right? But we don't. And so we run that as a test just to make sure that we haven't found something, that our data is falling into this pattern without reason, for no reason whatsoever. So we ran that as a test. Okay. So that's basically the story. It's a pretty simple story, but it's a pretty provocative story. And this is still in draft. We're still working on it. And we may have to throw it out the window because it doesn't make any sense, right? So give us some reasons to throw it out the window. I know you have a question. Yeah.
Yeah, what I was telling before that I would be very curious to see, but I understand you cannot show today more evidence regarding the parallel trends assumption, whether it could be the case that, or maybe it's a bit of an institutional background question as well, whether it could be the case that districts that are struggling the most get more
So you
funding.
want to see sort of an event
kind of
study
see-
analysis, you look at the trends before.
Exactly.
That's an interesting question, and we've been thinking about whether or not that's possible to do with the data that we have on hand. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Yeah.
How do you account for teacher quality within this study, considering I taught in Texas and many of the teachers that are hired are uncertified? So how can that play into the quality of the educator on whether or not they're actually impactful?
Well, this is similar to the class size study in California that has been discussed a lot. Rand did that study, and they found out that when they were forced by a constitutional amendment to the California state constitution to reduce the size of classes in districts throughout the state, that actually it had no benefit for students. And their interpretation was, well, we got smaller classes, but we had to hire so many teachers overnight that we had to deep digger into the prospective teacher pool, and therefore we got a lower quality teacher. And you could say that when you are expanding more rapidly in one district rather than in another district, that those districts are bringing in new teachers. And we know that the beginning teacher is the least effective teacher in the classroom, that you have less learning when that happens. So that could be a mechanism that expansion of personnel means reduction in the quality of personnel. So we've attributed to the problem of organizing your staff and making use of your staff. And you're saying it could be this other factor instead. And I can't rule that out. I'll point out that the problem doesn't show up in the small districts, doesn't show up for the Hispanic students. I really love those initial findings, because if it was across the board, then you might look for other factors that have nothing to do with size and density. But we do see it greater in the more dense districts and in larger districts. So why would you get this differential effect if maybe there's a way of using that explanation, but that would be my first response to your idea. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Professor Peterson. I think I mean, firstly, thank you for sharing very interesting sort of data. And the reason for me to even throw out this research is because from a context where I come, we need more people, and to show that it's not working might not work. But I think I had a bunch of questions, but I think I'll stick to 2 or 3. One is, I mean, this point around quality is absolutely, like, more and more, I think we are seeing, at least from the global South context, the more teachers you put is not going to solve, because till the time there's no quality, you can still pump in a system with like 100 or 200 teachers. And that becomes a crucial part, right? Like what is the variable that in the study you were able to control or not control?
Yeah, so the question is, why do you think that quality correlates with the size of the district or the density of the district?
Because
are you saying districts that are already more dense will hire less qualified teachers?
We don't know that. And I don't know if that was a variable that played out in the study.
It would be nice to know, but we don't have that in the data set.
Got it. So I think the study was just around the increase in the district, because I think the option of rural and urban kind of communities also, there's a huge difference of how the quality of teachers that you get. I mean, I come from India, so I think even in the more and more hiring we are doing in the urban context, we're just not able to get good quality teachers. Whereas in rural, you're able to get that. It's a scenario.
You're able to get higher quality teachers in rural areas.
Yes. And I think that's been a big shift. And because of that, I think the rural education outcomes are much
generally better. Not what most people find in the United States, that the quality, it's the rural areas that have the most, find it most challenging to hire additional staff.
True. But I think even the urban elite also get into richer schools. So I think it's hard to then do anything if you're in the private schooling system. Okay, so that was one. And you had mentioned about 80% of the children going to the large district. what percentage of the overall districts in US are considered as large districts?
Oh, what do we mean by a large district?
No, what percentage of the overall districts are large in US?
What percentage of all districts are large districts? Yes, we've divided them into quartiles. So it's 25% of the distribution. So I'll remember we eliminated 10% of the districts that were the tiniest. So in the remaining districts, we divide them into quartiles. So, and this, here I'm just referring to the largest quartile, which is the top 25% of the distribution. So the top 25% of the distribution is what we mean when we say large districts. Now, it happens to be the case that if you're a large district, you have a lot of students. It's defined by the number of students in the district. That's right. We're going by student enrollment when we say it's a large district. So a large district has a lot of students. So this means that it turns out that 80% of all students are going to school in a large district. So it's where most students are attending school. And the size of that district, it can be as small as 10,000 students and still fall into that large, because so many school districts are small. Yes.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the mechanism of more people is attention and feedback. Implicitly, you didn't spend a lot of time on the page of but given that, AI obviously is the question, right? Given AI tutoring, AI teaching, I just spent some time with Alpha School, the 2 hours a day of instant feedback and the incredible 2x to 5x advancement in learning. How is an AI tutor, which you have one-to-one basically feedback within a classroom, what do you think will change?
So maybe we could replace all the people with just automatic things, and then that would solve all the coordination
That's
problems.
not my question. My question was specifically, given that your calculation, or given that the implicit connection between increased people and improvement was feedback specifically.
So, that's why this concept of loose coupling is one that I alluded to here. We go into it more in the paper itself. We discuss why we should expect this. But school districts, the loose coupling theory says teachers are semi-autonomous within their classroom. They're expected to be doing things as they see fit.
Sure.
And then the principals have some responsibilities for the hallways and maybe checking up on the teachers and so forth. But they too are autonomous vis-a-vis higher level administrators. And then as you get into a bigger district, you've got to have more levels. You've got to have hierarchies. So you either that or one person has to be responsible for a wider and wider thing. So the more people you add to a system, either you have to have more hierarchies or you have to have one person responsibility for more places. And that's what Anthony Downs says. And so does March and Simon. They both point out the trouble that you run into when you have a bigger organization with more personnel in it, because it becomes more difficult. That's why you get more wasted activity. But in education, you would expect to find the thing about education, it's very personnel dense, right? It's not like electricity or a power system or a transportation system where you can create lots of benefits to a population with relatively few people engaged. This is a human capital intensive industry, and that's why this problem of organizational control is such a huge issue in education, because you've got a lot of people you've got to coordinate. And so at the margins, now I'm not saying at any point here that a teacher is not important or that personnel is not important. What we're talking about is adding personnel to an organization that's already large, or adding personnel to an organization that's already dense. So it's not, we're not saying anything about the importance of these personnel in general. We're talking about the problems that you encounter when you try to add personnel to a complicated organization. Jim, you have a right to ask questions.
Okay, well, that's, and maybe even an entitlement, I don't know. So I have a hypothesis, which I'd love you to comment on, and then a question. The hypothesis sort of relating to what you're just talking about is whether adding non-teaching personnel is not only just creating the problems of scale in a large, complicated organization, but may result in less student contact time with the teacher and more time with paraprofessionals and other staff. So if you assume that the time hasn't changed, but the number of people and their roles and responsibilities have shifted, such that students are expected to spend more time with people who are not their lead classroom teacher, maybe that has some negative effect on student outcomes. Anyway, it's a thought. My question, though, is the overall teacher population hasn't moved basically over this time. And so if there are districts that are hiring more teachers, I guess that implies there are some districts that are losing teachers or letting them go, or attrition or otherwise. Were there any findings about the districts that were shrinking in terms of their teacher staff, and whether that had any negative or positive effects?
Well, we do find in the districts that are not growing that this problem is more severe. So that's consistent with your idea.
When they're not growing, but they're still hiring teachers.
Yes, we're getting increased density, even though the district is shrinking. So the classic example is the Boston public school system, where they're hiring more administrators in the central office, despite the fact that the enrollment has fallen by a large margin. Whereas the central staff has increased in size. That would be sort of a classic example. So yes, I don't want to say that that's the general pattern. That's a good anecdote, but it's entirely possible that, well, first of all, it's hard to get rid of personnel when you're shrinking. And so you may be keeping people beyond what you really need them for, and that's adding to the complexity of the organization. So yes, in many of our models, almost all of our models, we control for this growth factor, because we think that that's also an element in the story. But this is a pattern that we observe even after we control for whether or not a district is growing in size or not.
But I guess my question is whether there's some districts in the data set where the density is actually going in the other direction, where they're losing staff relative to students, and their class sizes or their ratios.
That's an interesting point, and maybe we could take a look at isolate those that are actually losing a significant share of students and see what happens when you have additional personnel there. That's only about 20% of the sample, but we could take a look at that 20% and see if we get it. And your other comment was well taken too. Your first one, I've forgotten.
Just that the students' time ends up getting distributed across other people other than their teacher.
And the finding that I find most embarrassing is the one about teachers, because when we began the study, what we expected to find was you would get benefits from additional teachers, but you were getting no benefits from the other staff. That was sort of the idea in the back of the head. I didn't expect to find negative effects. I expected to see no effects, but the negative effects sort of popped out of us. And the negative effect that was the most troubling was that we were getting negative effects from adding teachers. And so, but maybe we should control for adding what your comments suggest, that we should control for the additional of other staff and see whether those negative effects from teachers persist, because your explanation could say, well, it's just adding those other people is reducing the amount of time that a teacher is spending. I just heard a story about New York City. In New York City, a teacher can only teach, have 3 contact hours of students at a time. Then they have to have a break. And so it may be that adding staff leads to more breaks for teachers, which may be more disruptive for students because they have less continuity in their learning experience. So that's another way of thinking of how. The other problem that you run into is, even though they are called teachers, they may not be teaching. So this additional to the teaching staff may not be actually adding teachers, but it may be, because we haven't seen much in the reduction of class size. Well, that's still the pupil teacher ratio. But so we know that a lot of teachers are used for other activities at the school, whether it's guidance counselors or for master teachers or supervisory teachers or other kinds of you have to be a teacher before you could be anything else in the school system. So everybody in the school system, other than people who are non-professionals, all the professionals in the school system will be former teachers, because that's your recruitment into the school system. Not everybody, but a high percentage of them. So it may be that a lot of these teachers that are still classified as teachers, but they're doing other kinds of things.
I have a clarification question, mostly. Can you help me understand how you measured learning in terms of months at the district level, like technically, and like why you chose that kind of outcome to measure versus?
Well, it's all measured in standard deviations in the article and in the paper that we have written. It's all measured in standard deviations. So we have translated standard deviations into number of months to make it clear to a lay audience, and for the purposes of this presentation, to avoid revealing things about our data which we cannot reveal until we've gotten approval from the Department of Education. So basically, we say that between 4th grade and 8th grade, which is when we have the data for, is 8th grade. So 4 years between 4th grade and 8th grade, a student gains about 1 standard deviation on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Well, that means that every year they gain 0.25 on average. So 25% of a standard deviation is equivalent to 1 year. So if you have half of that, say 13% or 12% of a standard deviation, that would be 6 months. So which is what we're getting in these waves, but then we divide it to 3 months because it's over a 2-year period. So, and reporting about months per year rather than months per wave. So yeah, our coefficients are running around 10 to 15% of standard deviation. Yeah.
And is it in terms of math and reading scores?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's only math and reading scores because that's all we have on a consistent basis over this time period. So the government has a policy of administering math and reading tests during this period every 2 years, but they don't other subjects. So we can't fold in other subjects. Yes.
So first of all, thank you so much for presenting this research. I was also particularly concerned with the adverse impacts it was having on larger districts. And I'm thinking about particularly larger districts that exist in urban areas that house mostly Black and Brown students. And I was wondering if any of your research had taken into account the higher teacher turnover rates in those districts and what introducing more teachers into those districts looks like, or whether they're just kind of feeding right into that turnover rate and creating more instability for the students, and that's why it's having adverse impacts.
You said it. That's exactly my interpretation, is that in districts where you're adding more personnel, you're creating more opportunities for churn. You're giving existing staff new opportunities to go elsewhere, maybe out of teaching into an administrative role, or maybe to a different part of the district, or maybe to a different classroom within the district. So all of that means that those classrooms that have disproportionate disadvantaged students will be getting more beginning teachers, who are the ones that are most likely to be struggling in the classroom.
Yeah, I guess that complicates things in my head a little, because a lot of the times when we talk about policy solutions for decreasing the gap between like the educational disparities, we talk about bringing more teachers into schools that exist in marginalized communities and marginalized areas. So I guess this research kind of I don't know, changes
Well,
that?
we have a lot of rules that work in the opposite direction, and the seniority rule is a very powerful rule. I think it exists in nearly every district. Correct me if I'm wrong, but school districts generally say if there's an opening in the school district, the most senior teacher has the first chance at it. And then you go down the line, and then the openings that remain are filled with new teachers. Well, there's a lot of data that shows that new teachers are highly concentrated in schools that have a disproportionate concentration of disadvantaged students. So you have to think about, given the rules that we have, is bringing more people in really beneficial to the most disadvantaged students in the school system? Well, you got to net out the costs that are going to be happening when you do that.
I want to return to the comment that you brought up, because I do think, we saw the graph with the huge spike in school staff. And schools are becoming more of a social service provider. So students may be spending more time with the social worker, with the mental health specialist, with school counselors. So they might be getting positive health or emotional effects, but still get the adverse learning effects.
Yes, well, you could make the claim that we're sacrificing certain academic outcomes, but we're getting social outcomes that are more desirable. That really, if you look at the social, mental, emotional development of the child, which is also very important, we're getting a lot of benefits there that offset any deficits that I'm observing or we are observing. So, yeah, that's a possibility. We can't eliminate it. It is the case that social emotional well-being is highly correlated with academic well-being. And so my argument would be, well, the theory behind all of this is that that should all translate into academic progress. So we're going to strengthen the child overall in their social and emotional dimensions, and we're going to see a payoff academically. Well, it hasn't happened. Yes.
I'm wondering, in the districts that did not increase their density, if there was investments that were made that were more impactful, that brought up the average. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas. I know that's kind of about this, outside of the scope, but what would have been maybe a more prudent investment for these districts?
Well, the one thing I can say in that regard is hire people who can teach 2 languages instead of just 1. And I think we have an incredible shortage of bilingual teachers in our educational system. And it could very well be that the places that are hiring more staff are hiring more staff with bilingual skills or enhancing their bilingual program. Because I cannot otherwise explain this incredibly interesting exception to the general pattern. Yeah.
Paul, we should say that's, hello, this is Carlos. Don't know if you can hear me. Hello, sorry I joined late. But the other thing we could say to that question, which is a very good question, I think you didn't go over it, but we do find a positive effect of salaries, increasing teacher salaries in our study.
That is a good point, Carlos, and I mentioned it at the beginning, but I didn't come back to it. We see positive effects of salary increases on learning. It's not very large. It's maybe about a month of learning, I think it is, or something in that range. But it's not, we don't ever find an adverse effect of salary increases. So clearly, if you were to believe this study, you would say concentrate additional revenues on salary increases for existing personnel rather than, and we find it for others too, don't we, Carlos? It's not just teachers that we get benefits from salaries, or isn't it across the board?
Well, so for teachers, we find it more consistently across all groups, and on average, for paraprofessionals and school staff, on average, the direction of the effects of increased salaries is positive, but not statistically significant, but it is for some of the subgroups of different district sizes. So.
Okay, so it's most clearly beneficial for teachers,
Right.
which would only make sense. So yes, thank you for bringing that up, Carlos. So the main reason we haven't made more of that is our measure of salaries is a little less, precise than the ones that we have for personnel. Wouldn't you say? What's your view of that, Carlos?
Yeah, we can talk more. I mean, there's so we use throughout the district, we have to rely on how districts report these data on salaries. And so the categories for how they classify the different staff is a lot longer and is different for salaries. That is for the counts of people. So we have to so basically the counts of teachers doesn't necessarily match the portion of salaries that correspond solely to teachers, right? So it's a noisier measure, and the same for the others.
Right. For example, the salaries of teachers and non-professionals are combined together into one big category called instructional salaries. And we know that teachers are much better paid than non-professionals. So, but we can't break it out. All we have is total amount spent on instructional salaries. But having said that, we nonetheless, despite the fact that we have a poor measure, we still see an effect. So if you're seeing an effect with a poor measure, that might suggest that a better measure would show an even larger effect for salaries. I would think that we're underestimating the positive effects of higher salaries for personnel and especially for teachers.
This may sort of reinforce the point that if you're instead of spending money on new staff, you're spending money on higher salaries, that improves stability and retention, whereas the other strategy may encourage or facilitate churn and instability. So that, I mean, those two things may be, same side of this, or different sides of the same.
They're not inconsistent. Yeah. Right. Yes.
I think it's fascinating because I think all the studies that at least we have seen, and Professor Karthik Muralidharan from UC San Diego proved exactly the opposite, right? Like his big research that happens is even with increase in salaries, it didn't affect the learning much in the longer term. So I think I'd love to sort of, when the study is out, I'd love to read more on that. But I have two questions. One is from all the data that you've accomplished or got right now, is there a way to establish this is the minimum density that a district requires for staff for it to be successful? Is there a corollary that you can make out?
So are you asking me to come up with how dense should a district be?
Yes.
Carlos, how dense should a district be? How large should it be?
So I don't think we've done that exercise. We could do it, right? As I think Paul has said a few times. What we're looking at is to the basically marginal changes in density at different levels. But we can think of we can do the exercise. It may be an interesting exercise to do to find at what levels we find the optimal effects. Right, when this ceases to be these marginal effects, which is what we're showing, cease to operate in the same direction and flip direction or go to zero. Right, so when the positive effects stop happening, when we have those positive effects.
Okay. Because as public policy professionals, that would be perfect answer to have, right? Because it's easy to push, get more funding to say that if we are this dense, we can achieve this level of results. So.
I think what we're showing in terms of size is that small, one of the things that happened during much of the 20th century is that we consolidated school districts. And Martin West actually did a study with Christopher Berry, which showed that they had the consolidation movement had negative effects on the students who were in school during that period, as measured by their adult wages. 20, 30 years later, they got data from the census that allowed them to see what were the long-term effects of being in a school that got consolidated. And everybody expected that there would be benefits from having a larger school district. But they got the opposite effect, that actually the consolidation movement had a negative effect. And that's quite consistent with what we find here, that the smallest districts are the ones that get positive benefits from additional personnel. So it may be that this whole idea that we need to have large aggregations in order to have an efficient system is the wrong theory of design. Now, there is a small school movement. There is this idea of going back to charter schools are a reflection of that. And the micro schools are another idea that's out there. So there is, contemporary thinking that's not inconsistent with sort of going back to an older model of autonomous units that would not encounter the organizational challenges that you face when you are trying to manage a large aggregation.
Maybe I'll ask my question a different way. When would you want to start adding AI as a variable going forward and looking at outcomes?
Well, I actually thought about AI when we were doing this, because clearly AI would allow you to operate with fewer people.
Right.
If you believe in AI as an educational tool, the problem that I used to be an advocate of virtual learning, because you could have a great teacher educate and an infinity of students, because you can put it all up online, great lectures. You could have the finest instructor with the most comprehensive knowledge of the topic, and you could have a whole series of them. And wouldn't this be the best education? It could be available to everybody at minimal cost, and this would be a wonderful online experience, and everybody would benefit from it. But then COVID came along, and we went to online, and the negative effects of going online were so pronounced at all levels of the educational system that the idea of mechanizing this very human process of face-to-face interactions it's a huge risk taking that on. So can we use avatars? Can we have an avatar come up and tutor us and say, come on, honey, I love you a lot, and just read this book. Yeah, just look at these words here. What do you think they mean? Wouldn't it be wonderful if that would all work? Because we could do that at scale at probably half the price or less than what we're paying today. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, actually, the young woman there, your conversation about fewer teachers and more social, whatever those.
Social emotional learning, yeah.
Right. I mean, this is what the Alpha School is doing. And I don't mean just to lean on one data point, but that entire movement is small amounts of education at 1x, 2x, 5x with social and emotional support. And it seems to be doing super well. I'm in higher ed, so I'm looking at what is happening on the scale. 92% of high school students are using AI. I think we're down to about 60% in middle school and about 30% at the elementary school level. I'm looking at that reality of what that means when somebody is not getting 100% of what from the teacher in the class, but maybe 50% of what comes from the teacher in the class and 50% from this external phenomenon. That makes things really hard to measure.
Sorry, I just wanted to add on this. Didn't mean to take more airtime, but the idea of AI is also we're looking at more as a replacement to teacher. That's what I think you are hinting at, and I share your criticism. But I think there have been numerous studies of how AI can also improve the efficiency of a teacher.
Yes.
I think I was a public school teacher, and if I had AI when I was teaching, like it would have done wonders, created differentiated plans for my kids and everything. And now it can do it at a much faster rate than increasing the density, which is going to support teachers. That's how I'm looking at the AI to say existing teachers, can they become more efficient rather than saying that it's going to replace teacher? Because I'm with you on this. I don't think it should, and I don't think it will. But yeah.
Well, I'm not ready to rule it out as a educational strategy. I just think we need to learn a lot more before we sort of see this as the solution. Yeah. All right. Have we covered the waterfront?
Did you have another question? Okay. Good. I think we're done.
All right.
Thank
very
you.
much.